All right, everybody. Welcome to the session. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very, very excited to be speaking to you today about something that's really interesting in all of our different research projects. So, in fact, we come from fairly different research backgrounds, and we've been speaking about disappearance, displacement, and loss for a little while now, actually, for just over a year. And that's because about a year ago, the three of us were all in a conference together. And when we shared that session, this started a whole range of conversations between us. And one of the core themes between our pretty different projects was the idea of disappearance. But we all approach disappearance in very, very different ways. So this got us thinking more about interdisciplinarity, about disappearance, about loss, and how we could work together as graduate students. And what we found is over the course of the year in developing a paper together, one of our best ways of working through this paper is actually just having conversations with one another. So instead of giving you today presentations with just PowerPoint slides where we work through each of our own respective projects, we're going to emulate a little bit our own process of thinking through displacement and disappearance and loss by having a conversation. So what you're watching here today is live, in effect. I mean, it's recorded, but it's live. So we're just having a conversation. We're going to talk through each of our respective projects and how we think about displacement, disappearance, and ecological loss and how it relates to our own work. And then we're going to engage in roughly a 5-minute conversation. So Josh is going to speak for about 2.5 minutes. Then Siobhan is going to speak for about 2.5 minutes. And then I'll take it away. And then we're going to have just a general conversation. So please forgive us for any ums, ahs, and stumbles. We're figuring this out. We're having a conversation in real time, which is really exciting and a bit nerve-wracking, which is why I'm speaking at 1,000,000 miles an hour. So I'm going to slow it down there, and I'm going to let Josh take it away. Okay, Josh.
Thanks, Claudia, and hi, everyone. So before I enter into any sort of conversation or my ideas about what loss and disappearance, are, I think that it's important to take a step back with my work and consider appearance and how ecology and beings in the world appear to us, because that, in many ways, will dictate meaningfully how things or beings disappear. And so to do that, I'm going to ask for the forgiveness of my two friends and colleagues here, because they've heard this thought experiment probably about 100 times. But this comes from Neil Everden and in his book, The Natural Alien. And to paraphrase Neil, he has a thought experiment. Is a gorilla in a zoo still a gorilla? Is it a gorilla at all? Or is it a gorilla-shaped bag of genes that is otherwise devoid of all the environmental and social milieus that constitute it? And so this sort of thinking about relationships as being constitutive of beings themselves really begins to complicate ideas of loss and thicken them. It's not quite as simple as a being disappearing in any material sense. But when the relationships that constitute beings are amiss as well, then we can begin to think about loss in different ways. So that's actually that's can be overwhelming. So I'll just focus in for right now on place, because place is very interesting. And places aren't inert, static containers that are awaiting, agency of some sort of being. Places are made, right? Places are where things happen. Places are made, and reciprocally, we, in probably the broadest sense that I can use that term, we are made by places as well. We make places and they make us. And so this, as I already said, reciprocal, cyclical relationship constitutes who we are. And this is to borrow from Nasi in being singular plural and the sort of Heideggerian tradition. And even Barad's interaction, that this is a being with, right? That all of the relationships, we are being with places and other constituents, and they make us who we are. And so following that, I don't want to speak too long, following that, disappearance and loss doesn't have to come necessarily in the form or have to be death or extinction, or as I said, these more permanent material losses. But changes in the way that relationships and assemblages of relationships are formed constitutes, is my contention, disappearance. So a displacement of a being from one place, a particular place that it is made, it's both made with and made of. Displacement of a being from that place, lots of place words, that marks a disappearance. To go back to the gorilla example, the displacement of the gorilla from the jungle into the zoo marks a disappearance of the jungle gorilla. And so I'll leave that there. But as I said, I'm arguing that displacement marks a disappearance. And I'll hand it over to Siobhan.
Thank you for that. That actually segues so perfectly because into my section, because I'm speaking about, monkeys and conservation work on the ground. So I'll just begin. "We are in the monkey's home," said a naturalist guide once to me. I walked with him through Manuel Antonio National Park in Costa Rica, a site of multi-species encounter where human and non-human primates share in food, mischief, and pathogens. The monkeys here seem to me frontiersmen. They're changing with the times. We're in their home, and over years, they've adapted to us, rolling with the punches of deforestation, exploiting us for food, sunscreen, and insect repellent, frisking our bags when left unattended. Not only is a significant portion of their diet human-sourced, but monkeys even initiate most of the interactions, hence their reputation as a mafia. But this site, despite being a protected area and the most visited national park in the country, is still an interface of extinction. The forest edge is a frontier where capuchins, emboldened by years of tolerating human presence, come to commingle with us in the semi-wild. They move through borderlands from one forest patch to another to forage, disperse, or migrate. To do so, they must cross hazardous infrastructures such as uninsulated power lines and fast roadways, putting themselves at risk of accidents, electrocution, poaching, and attacks. As long as we're in close proximity to each other, monkeys are vulnerable to displacement from anthropogenic pressures or intervention. Or worse, individuals are disappearing entirely, and efforts are being made currently to assess how many monkeys are left in Costa Rica. The conservation status of capuchins and howler monkeys, for example, is listed as of least concern by the IUCN, and yet some sanctuaries see over 100 individuals of these species passing through their rescue centers every year. This rate of loss is just obviously unsustainable. Furthermore, the network of human and ecological relations belonging to an individual monkey are unique, like a fingerprint. These connections are severed when a monkey is displaced from a natural area, and whether they are reintroduced into the wild or remain in a sanctuary for life, the nature of being monkey for that individual has undoubtedly changed. While a sanctuary monkey in a captive setting is obviously displaced from the wild, such as the gorilla in a zoo analogy, I suspect that even displaced monkeys who are reintroduced back to the wild will always be a displaced individual. And in that is a fundamental loss. For example, habituated monkeys are more susceptible to injury, poaching, disease, and death, and so candidates for release have to learn misanthropy. We literally try to manage through rehabilitation how they view us and both what wildness will look like for them. And while the grand efforts of rehabilitation and reintroduction aim to restore their wild agency with as little intervention and post-release support as possible, in reality, primate conservation is a mess of trade-offs, hard choices, and unglamorous emotional and physical labor. Monkeys are caught up in the cycle of rescue, rehabilitation, and release like refugees, the stateless, vulnerable charges of the sanctuary, a hospice for some in place of hope for others. Ultimately, my research into monkey lives at these sanctuaries attempts to understand what factors are leading to their endangerment and how these overlapping human-monkey boundaries is being exacerbated by ecotourism, which is the number one industry in the country. My research is optimistic, however, as I wonder whether these sanctuaries can, as Juno Perennius writes in Decolonizing Extinction, teach us how to share a future together amid mass annihilation. And so with that, I will turn it over to Claudia.
Thanks so much. So going from gorillas to monkeys, mine takes a slightly different step and instead speaks about cows. My research is not interested so much in animals that go extinct or that disappear and are thought of in kind of conservation terms, but actually an animal that's become quite prolific and is found in almost every country across the world, and those are cows. And I'm interested in how cows have disappeared from a very particular place. And it's interesting how Josh started speaking about, how displacement and place are connected. I mean, obviously, I guess place is embedded therein. But for me, what's interesting is in many North American cities and many European cities, some 200 years ago, these cities were filled with large animals like cows and horses. And whereas horses might fill people's, urban imaginaries or historical imaginaries as to what cities once looked like, cows are not only physically absent from these city spaces, but in many cities, they are conceptually absent as historical agents or subjects as well in these spaces. And this got me thinking about the idea of disappearance, because we do speak a lot about disappearance and displacement, I think, in ecological terms today, thinking about species that are on the brink of extinction or about to go extinct. And yet you have another species that is proliferating. There's between 1 to 1.5 billion cows on the face of the planet today, and they are connected to some extent to the ecological loss of other animals, but not of their own choosing, but because of oftentimes humans' consumptive practices, which again happen in cities. So not only in cities, but primarily, some of the most consumption happens in cities. So my research is interested in the historical disappearance, but as we have this kind of ecological conversation, I'm also interested in the idea of how some animals, a specific species, can disappear from a place, become ubiquitous, but at the same time seem conceptually absent, conceptually gone from our kind of imaginations of a place. And not just that, you can imagine that there are 1.5 billion cows, certainly. But what we don't realize is that within there are, almost 1.5 thousand breeds. And most of these are dominated by a handful of specific breeds. So you've got indigenous species going extinct all over the show. Anyway, mine was jambled and all over the show, and I'm going to cut it here because we've got about 2.5 minutes to just ask each other questions. But what I really wanted to drive home is it's not just that at the species level that things disappear. You can have people and places and animals being severed from a place over time that are not only materially disappear, but conceptually disappear too.
Yeah, I had something kind of going off of that, and now this is a new thought. So this is really truly organic. So hopefully it makes sense. Which was I started thinking about historical absence from narratives, cultural narratives, historical narratives of city life. Western cities where cows. We're speaking about cows where they once were and now have been effectively erased from the cultural and historical imaginary. And I was thinking, but biologically, their biological history as members of the mixed human ecological, really humans are part of the ecology, the ecological community of the urban environment. The legacies of their pathogens, of their position in food networks, in their position in like food industry, of total human intervention, all of these things, like those are like not material fossils maybe today, but biologically, the biological history has been stored, but they've been culturally erased from the imaginary. And it strikes me as interesting because monkeys in Costa Rica are omnipresent, and one of the major focuses of tourism campaigns and industry, sloths, monkeys, all the big, like how you have the big 5 safari, you've got like the big tropical mammals you want to see, and yet biologically they're suffering. And so it's interesting. They're like historically at the forefront of the cultural conscience, but biologically, biologists are crying out for reassessments of their conservation status.
Yeah.
So it's almost the flip of the cows historically.
Well, this is what I think is so interesting about our two examples juxtaposing against one another, because you said at one point, you said being monkey. And I think being cow has obviously also shifted over time. Being an urban cow versus being a feedlot cow is a very different way of being cow. And now you're seeing monkeys move into urban spaces. Being wild monkey versus being urban monkey is a very different way of being monkey. And again, this kind of brings in, the place dimensions. So for them to be absent from a place. And I know that we're just kind of muddling around in these concepts, but I think there's something there, and I'm not quite sure what it is
Yeah.
yet.